Mars had been disappointing us for 31 days. It did it methodically, one promising signal at a time. A bright return under the regolith that turned into a collapsed lava tube. A mineral anomaly that came back as a sensor glitch. A thermal pocket that bought us 4 hours of drilling and gave us a cavity full of dead basalt. By the start of week 5, even Neil Pruitt had run out of fresh complaints and fallen back on reliable ones. Ration texture, suit seals, the way Martian dust found every hinge on every tool we owned. I'd gotten good at reading the finer shades of his grumbling. The steady low-level kind meant he was tired and functioning. Silence from Neil usually meant one of two things. He was angry, or he'd found something worth shutting up for. So when he called me over to Grid 14, and I heard nothing in his voice but concentration, I left my own survey line half-flagged and went. He was crouched over the ground-penetrating unit with his visor polarized against the afternoon glare, one gloved finger tapping the display. "Garrett," he said, "come look at this." I dropped beside him and braced one hand against the compacted regolith. The radar screen painted subsurface density in the usual gradients. Orange for loose material, red for solid rock, black for voids. Most of Mars looked like noise unless you stared long enough to teach your brain what mattered. This mattered. At 12 meters down sat a black rectangle in a field of orange, sharp-cornered and clean-edged, roughly 8 meters wide and at least 20 long. No feathering, no natural irregularity, no fracture spread, just geometry. "Run it again," I said. He did. Same sweep, same angle, same return. The rectangle came back unchanged, like it had been waiting for us to accept what we were seeing. I toggled my comms to the habitat channel. "Alcott, you seeing Neil's feed?" Dr. Raymond Alcott answered immediately, which meant he'd already been watching. "I see it. Those boundaries are regular. Reinforced walls, possibly concrete or a densite analog. Garrett, that is not geological." "I know what it is. I want a bore sample today." I looked at Neil. He lifted his eyebrows inside his helmet, the closest he came to saying your call, but don't pretend this isn't already decided. I authorized the excavation at 14:30 local. We brought the boring rig over from the secondary cache and cut straight down through 12 meters of compacted regolith. At 11 meters, the drill tone changed. Spend enough years around equipment and you learn the difference between resistance and contact by ear. This was contact, hard, uniform, artificial. At 12 meters, the bit punched through, and a puff of fine dust vented up the shaft before the thin atmosphere tore it apart. We widened the hole, rigged a descent line, and I went down first. That was the rule on every breach I'd ever led. The person best equipped to judge an unstable structure went first. I didn't send the geologist. I didn't send the linguist. I didn't send the scientist who wanted the answer badly enough to stop respecting the question. My helmet lamp found a corridor. Concrete walls, cracked but intact. Low ceiling, heavy steel blast doors at both ends. Dust lay on the floor in a film so even it looked poured. The air inside, what there was of it, was vacuum. Same as the surface. Nothing had moved down here in a very long time. Then my lamp found the stenciling on the wall. Cyrillic. Military block lettering, faded red paint gone brown with age. I couldn't read Russian, but I'd seen enough preserved Cold War infrastructure on joint training tours to recognize the bureaucratic uniformity of Soviet military signage. Same spacing, same utilitarian neatness, same institutional certainty that whatever they built would outlast the men assigned to it. "Neil," I said, "get Dana on the ground channel." He didn't make a joke. That was the first moment I let myself understand how strange this really was. Dana Whitfield reached the site within 90 minutes, breath fogging the inside of her helmet as she read the markings off the corridor walls. Directional arrows, load warnings, installation designations. Her voice stayed level, though I could hear how hard she was working to keep it there. Soviet military. Early 70s, probably. Research Installation 47, Eastern Division. We forced the first blast door by hand, Neil on the wheel, me bracing the warped frame, and the corridor beyond opened into a collapsed section of outer wall. Past it lay a landscape that had no right to exist on Mars. Trees, birch and larch rooted in dark soil that was visibly, offensively Earth-like after a month of red dust and iron oxide. They stood in a broad crescent beyond the breach, trunks petrified by vacuum and cold but still recognizable down to the peeling bark. A chain-link fence topped with razor wire ran along the tree line, some posts canted, others still upright. At the eastern corner stood a wooden watchtower, rough-built and weathered into stillness, leaning perhaps 15 degrees but somehow unfallen. Its observation slit pointed upward at an angle that would have made sense under a different sky. A higher horizon, a different planet's curvature. Near the fence line lay the dogs. 4 of them, half buried in the frozen soil. Large-bodied, likely military working animals from the size and the remnants of harness material still clinging to 2 of the torsos. The cold had kept them with merciless fidelity. One was fixed mid-stride, front legs extended as if it had been running toward the fence when the air vanished. Another's jaw had frozen back far enough to show individual teeth. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Mars is full of silence, but this was a different kind. Surface silence is environmental. This was human silence, the kind that happens when 4 people look at the same impossible thing and understand at the same moment that disbelief has become a luxury. Dana's voice came through my comms, carefully measured. The entry corridor mentions Project Dvoinik, double, or twin, depending on context. It's a code name. Command center, I said. That would be where I'd start. Behind us, farther back in the bunker, Alcott and Neil were already arguing in low voices about imaging sequence and contamination protocol. Their words overlapped in my earpiece until I cut in. We go deeper, I said. On my schedule, my checkpoints. Nobody touches anything without my authorization. Alcott gave me a clipped acknowledgement that sounded like obedience and felt like deferred resistance. Inside, the bunker was unmistakably Soviet in the way some institutions are more recognizable as habits than as architecture. Barracks, mess hall, communications room, infirmary, command center. Everything laid out with the efficiency of a system that built the same hardened shell over and over in different corners of Siberia and expected each one to function identically. The structure had held. Thermal stress had cracked the concrete, but the load-bearing walls were solid, the blast doors operable, the bones intact. We found the dead. 17 skeletons lay distributed across the installation in patterns that resolved into narrative if you knew how to read a failed site. Several were in the corridor leading toward the infirmary, spaced in a way that suggested organized movement rather than panic. 2 were still in bunks, blankets drawn up, the posture of people who had lain down knowing they would not stand again. Others remained at workstations in the communications room, upright in their chairs, hands resting where equipment had once mattered. The infirmary changed the whole shape of what we thought we'd found. 5 skeletons there were dressed in vacuum suits. These weren't improvised pressure garments or bulky prototypes. They were sleek, structurally elegant, decades ahead of anything the 70s should have been capable of producing. Flexible composite shells, articulated joints, compression ring helmet seals that looked disturbingly close to systems my own suit designers would have recognized with envy. The materials alone belonged to the wrong era, and each suit interfaced directly with bone. Ports at the wrists, along the spine, at the throat. Hard-mounted titanium anchor points bolted into skeletons that showed healed scarring around every contact site. Whoever wore these had survived the procedures. Someone had cut living men open, fixed hardware to their skeletons, and sealed them into systems designed for an environment no bunker in eastern Siberia should ever have needed to survive. I crouched beside one of the suits and studied the spinal mount. The work was symmetrical, the kind of precision that comes from training and a plan. "Dana," I said, "I need the command logs." She was already halfway to the shelf. The command center gave us frozen paper logbooks and a rack of magnetic tape reels. Dana handled the books like she was turning pages in a morgue, photographing each spread before the paper had time to warm under the lamps. Alcott catalogued the reels. Neil shot high-resolution imagery and muttered under his breath about dust contamination and archival handling, which was the most reassuring sound I'd heard since we broke the surface. The earliest entries were administrative. Personnel assignments, supply counts, communication schedules with a higher authority identified only as Dvoinik. Then the tone shifted. Dana translated in short pieces at first, standing at the shelf because none of us wanted to move farther than necessary from what we'd found. "Colonel Menshoff," she said, "First Commander. He reports the experiment exceeded projected spatial parameters." She turned a page. 3 days later, the sky changed color, exterior pressure dropping. Another page. 5 days later, it becomes survival documentation. She didn't read the next section aloud immediately. She photographed it first, then exhaled through her nose. "He thinks they've been displaced to a high-altitude plateau, Central Asia, maybe. They don't understand it yet." Her voice softened, not with pity exactly, but with the strain of giving words back to men who had died believing the wrong thing. "He describes a sound like tearing metal that lasts for hours, air evacuating so fast that 3 men in the exterior yard die before the blast doors can close." Menshov died 11 days after the displacement. No cause listed. Command passed to Major Konstantin Vasiliev. His first entry was 4 words. "Situation assessed. Work begins," Dana translated. Neil from the corridor called, "Garrett." We found the lower access stairwell behind a sealed maintenance partition. The concrete steps descended past the bunker's mapped levels. At the first landing, Soviet construction ended. Below it, the walls were carved from dark stone, machine clean in ways no Soviet pour or cut should have been. Alcott was already leaning over the rail, lamp aimed downward, voice gone rough with awe. "This isn't Soviet," he said. "They built on top of something." I caught his arm before he could move. 1 level, visual only. He looked at me with that expression he wore when he thought caution was just another word ambitious people used for someone else's fear. "History doesn't usually come to people who wait for perfect conditions, Garrett. Good thing I'm not here to meet history. I'm here to get my team back alive." He almost smiled at that. Not because he agreed, because he thought I was telling myself a smaller story than the one unfolding around us. The dust storm hit that night. Regional event, fast and dense, visibility gone to 0 in under 10 minutes. We sealed ourselves into the habitat and listened to abrasive particles scour the outer shell for 14 hours. When it passed and we returned to Grid 14, Mars had done excavation work our machines couldn't have matched in a week. A full meter of regolith had been stripped from the bunker's perimeter. The transplanted forest now lay exposed in a clean crescent nearly 200 meters across. Fence line, watchtower, dark soil, frozen dogs, and worse things beneath. At the margins where the Siberian ground met the Martian surface, the two didn't simply touch. They fused. Birch roots threaded through basalt that seemed to have accepted them without heat, without fracture, without any process I knew how to name. Fence posts were embedded in Martian stone, as though both materials had agreed coldly and instantly to occupy the same coordinates. The storm had also cut deeper below the earth layer, opening vertical sections through the boundary zone. That was where Alcott found the arches. He dropped to one knee at the edge of the exposure and ran his glove along a series of channels carved into ancient Martian rock. His voice, usually controlled to the point of irritation, came out unguarded. "These are load-bearing forms. Garrett, this is architecture, engineered and old. The displacement didn't land on empty ground. It was laid on top of a pre-existing structure." Dana and I climbed down to a deeper cut where the storm had opened a clearer view. Beneath the Siberian soil, below the fused interface, sat an older substrate, forms worn by geological time, but still legible as design. At the center of the exposed section, partially embedded in the substrate, was the formation. 3 meters across, smooth, dark, geometric in a way that made the surrounding erosion look embarrassed. My helmet lamp hit its surface and came back wrong, sliding at angles that didn't fit its apparent shape. Everything around it had weathered. This looked untouched. Dana followed the line from the bunker's lower stairwell to the exposed formation and didn't bother pretending it was coincidence. They were digging toward it, she said. That night, back in the habitat, she translated deeper into Vasiliev's logs while I sat across from her with structural notes open on my tablet and absorbed none of them. The habitat lights made a bright island over the work table. Outside the viewports, Mars stayed black and empty. Dana turned a page, stopped, then turned it back. The entry describing Vasiliev's first descent is missing, she said. Several pages torn out. After that there's a gap of almost 3 weeks. When the handwriting resumes. She didn't answer immediately. She took another photograph, zoomed in, and laid the tablet flat between us. Different hand. Still Vasiliev's log? Yes, same authority codes. Someone writing under his clearance. I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my bunk reading Dana's translation files as she uploaded them, working from the first altered entry forward. The second author, probably the installation's medical officer, described Vasiliev's return in clinical language that somehow made it worse. He had gone down with 6 men. He came back alone after 9 hours. He was coherent. He recognized personnel. He resumed command functions. But his speech had changed. He used technical terms he'd never previously used, referred to events he had not witnessed, demonstrated fluency in operational details of Dvoinik that exceeded his clearance. The phrasing I couldn't stop staring at was stripped of all drama. Subject appears to carry memories not native to his own experience. The 6 men who descended with him were never mentioned again. In the morning, I briefed the team for a targeted recovery run. Bring back the magnetic tapes, finish imaging the infirmary suits, collect mineral samples from the stairwell walls at the first landing only. We stay on the mapped levels, I said. We hold at the second landing. We keep our distance from the formation. Alcott folded his arms. The most significant discovery in human exploration is sitting under that bunker, and you want to admire it from a staircase. I want to leave with the same number of people I brought in. That is not always the same thing as success. No, I said. Sometimes it's better. Dana watched us in silence. Neil rolled his shoulders inside his suit and said, "Can we schedule the philosophy seminar for after we're not standing on a dead Soviet anomaly?" It broke the tension just enough to move. We split. Dana and Alcott to the command center, Neil and I to the stairwell. 30-minute check-ins. The lower level was colder, only a few degrees by suit readout, but enough to feel like the temperature drop had intent behind it. Neil sampled the transition where Soviet concrete ended and the older stone began, dense, fine-grained, too regular. He worked, narrating half to himself as he sealed each container. "Look at this cut pattern," he said. "If Alcott tells me natural erosion did it, I'm taking his degrees away." That was Neil. Petty irritation as a baseline sign of life. I didn't know then how carefully I would later remember it. He moved toward the edge of the second landing to photograph the descent below. Past the bend, the walls shifted again from cut stone to the same dark composite as the formation in the exposed substrate. "I'm just checking the cable run around the corner," he said. "Soviets had power lines all the way down. Might tell us what equipment they were hauling." "Stay where I can see you." 10 seconds. He stepped around the bend. I heard 2 bootfalls, maybe 3. Then the sound cut off. It didn't fade or recede. It stopped, as if it had struck a hard edge. "Neil." No answer. I rounded the corner and found the stairwell empty. The next flight descended into shadow, dust undisturbed, no boot prints past the bend. His comm channel returned a carrier hiss with no voice. His transponder still pinged, Valid coordinates, active signal, placing him approximately 40 meters below the deepest mapped level of the bunker, inside solid substrate where no chamber, corridor, or void existed on any scan we had run. I keyed the general channel. Dana, Alcott, stairwell now. Neil is missing. We searched for 3 hours, every room, every maintenance gap, every access crawl and collapsed section. I kept the line at the second landing, even while Alcott pressed harder and harder that the answer was obviously below. He was right about where the transponder said Neil was. He was also asking me to take 3 more people down, toward the thing that had sent one Soviet officer back wearing someone else's mind. Dana ran the search grid without argument, methodical, controlled, checking Neil's signal every 5 minutes. Alcott stopped arguing after the first hour, and that worried me more. Quiet Alcott meant calculation. I was on the barracks level scanning a wall seam when Dana's voice snapped over the channel. Garrett! Neil's transponder just moved. Sector 2 barracks. Stationary. I reached the 3rd barracks room in under a minute. Neil was sitting on a bunk in the dark with his helmet open. The room was vacuum. His suit's emergency seal had cinched at the neck ring, keeping pressure around his head, but otherwise he sat with his hands on his thighs in a posture so composed it was instantly wrong. On the bunk beside him lay a Makarov pistol, placed neatly within reach. Neil! He lifted his eyes to me, alert, coherent, but the arrangement of his face had changed. The stillness, the attention, the angle of his head. Neil was a restless man. Even sitting, he usually looked like he was losing patience with the furniture. This was something else. Someone trained to wait. What year, he said carefully, is this? 2036. Neil, what happened? I went around the corner. His gaze moved across the room, cataloguing details. Then I was here. But it was occupied, lights on, air warm, men moving through the corridor with cable spools and winter uniforms, someone shouting assignments in Russian over a wall speaker. You were hallucinating. He looked at me with a composure I had never seen on his face. I was standing in this room in 1974. Dana arrived in the doorway with Alcott behind her. I held up a hand, keeping them back. Neil went on. One of the men looked directly at me and said something I didn't understand. Then I did. He said the major wanted the secondary trunk line run before evening shift. I knew which major. I knew where the line went. Dana stepped closer and asked him something in Russian. He answered instantly. Not tourist Russian or memorized phrases. Fluent, clipped, period-correct military Russian, fast enough that I lost any chance of following tone from rhythm alone. Dana listened for perhaps 10 seconds before her face changed. He's giving ranks, room assignments, equipment locations, she said. He says the infirmary has a secondary surgical suite behind a concealed east wall panel. I looked back at Neil. Are you Neil? He answered in English, and for one moment it was unmistakably him. I remember this morning. I remember you telling me not to go past the landing. A crack appeared in the composure, fear, brief and raw. I remember the corner, then I was somewhere else, warm, loud, and now I'm back. The crack closed. But there is another memory set, he said, and it does not stop. What happened at the bottom of the stairs? We found the point, the anchor. He looked down at his gloved hands as though they belonged to more than one man. Instruments said inert. We were freezing, running out of time. Vasiliev touched the surface because it was the only warm thing on this planet. Dana translated a Russian phrase he used under his breath. It opened. It showed designs, he said. Suit schematics, breathing systems, material ratios our chemists could synthesize from local minerals. It answered the problem we brought to it. Alcott took a step forward. A responsive archive. Neil's eyes shifted to him. I saw the look as a military one. Fast appraisal. Placement in a chain of consequence. It remembers contact, he said. It stores responses, and it had been waiting. He looked back to me. When it opened, it took 6 men. It gave back a version of Vasiliev that had been with it much longer than 9 hours. I reached over, picked up the Makarov, dropped the magazine, cleared the chamber, and pocketed both separately. Can you walk? Yes. Are you safe to move? The answer took too long. I do not know how to make that promise honestly. I should have quarantined him then. Medical isolation, restricted access, strict protocol, everything I'd ever been trained to do with a compromised person in a hazardous environment. Instead, I kept him with us. Because Neil was still in there. Because the thing sharing his body was our only first-hand witness. Because locking him alone in a room with whatever had come back with him felt less like procedure than abandonment. We moved him back to the habitat. Dana and I spent most of that night in the communications module while she worked through the tapes and I monitored Neil in the medical bay between translation passes. That helped. Breaking the information up helped. Instead of one continuous flood, the truth arrived in sections, each one making the next one worse. The tapes established Installation 47 first as geology, then as containment, then as weapons research. Deep instruments in eastern Siberia had detected rhythmic emissions from a point 80 meters below the surface. The readings matched nothing in Soviet records. The emissions were periodic, precise, and responsive. Seismic activity strengthened them. Industrial energy output nearby strengthened them more. A drilling team reached the source and found the formation. Same composite, same geometry, same impossible surface. They built the bunker over it. Project Dvoinik was what came after scientific curiosity learned there might be strategic use. The earliest tests were small. A metal cube vanished during an energy feed and never reappeared. A caged animal disappeared and returned 3 meters away, dead from what one pathologist called comprehensive spatial disorientation of internal structures. Dana read that phrase once, went silent, and pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose before continuing. Then came the full-scale demonstration. They intended to move a test payload, she said, not the installation. What happened? They fed the substrate with 3 diesel generators through buried conductor lines. The formation responded. It moved everything inside the perimeter. The bunker, the forest, the fence, the dogs, the tower. All of it. On to Mars, I said. She shook her head slightly. Vasiliev later concluded the Earth site and the Martian site occupy the same fixed point in some deeper coordinate frame. Not the same latitude and longitude, something underneath that. Same location, different world. I went to the medical bay after that section. Neil sat on the examination table with leads on his chest and wrists, watching the monitor display his own pulse. He looked more like himself than he had in the barracks, but there was still an extra stillness in him, as if some portion of his attention stayed angled elsewhere. "What are you hearing?" I asked. He knew what I meant. "Depends who you mean." "Both." He gave a humorless half-smile that belonged to Neil alone. "I'm hearing the vents in this room, the pump in Bay 2, Dana turning pages in the comm module, and someone who died before my parents were born trying very hard not to think about 6 men screaming." That was as close as he came to asking me not to leave him alone. I stayed until Dana called me back. Vasiliev, she said, had understood the mechanics better than the men above him ever did. He had also been wrong more than once. That mattered. His logs contradicted themselves in places. He revised hypotheses under stress. One entry insisted the cycle required external feeding. Another, weeks later, cast doubt on that conclusion. A third argued the formation was reacting to human proximity. Even with direct contact and survival conditions, the Soviets never fully knew what they were standing on. I made a point of remembering that. The suit program came next. The formation provided designs in response to contact, temporary inscriptions appearing on its surface, fading within hours. Soviet engineers copied them under armed supervision, built what they could from local minerals and salvaged materials, and surgically modified personnel to use them. The 5 suited skeletons in the infirmary were the remains of those efforts. Then the third cycle. Vasiliev had tried to reverse the displacement. Timed energy input, conductor lines, exact sequence. The formation discharged instead. It did not return them to Earth. It pulled in more material and created overlap. Dana read from the medical officer's account in a voice so flat I knew she was holding it that way on purpose. 3 men killed instantly by partial embedding. 2 extracted alive and then lost because the affected tissue no longer occupied contiguous space. 6th man never found. I imagined a surgeon standing over a living body whose organs no longer fully agreed on where they were. When Dana laid our own survey logs beside the Soviet emission curves, the problem sharpened. Baseline emissions at the formation had remained energetic but stable unless threshold conditions were met. The Soviet records showed a recognizable inflection, a steep upward bend, 6 to 10 hours before each documented displacement event. Our curve was climbing toward the same shape. Our radar passes, the boring rig, seismic charges, habitat generators running for a month. Dana pointed to the rising line on the screen. We thought we were stimulating it. We were. Maybe, she said. Or maybe we were interfering with it. Vasiliev isn't consistent. Before I could answer, the medical bay camera feed drew my eye. Neil had sat upright very suddenly. I went to him. He didn't wait for me to speak. The point cycles, he said. Builds, peaks, resolves. It took our soil the first time. Brought more the second. Killed 6 on the third when Vasiliev tried to force the pattern. His eyes found mine, fear in them, and something older layered behind it. You are here for the 5th. I brought Dana into the bay. She asked him questions in Russian. He answered in a mix of Russian and English, moving between selves faster now, less like possession and more like unstable overlap. When the generators stopped in Siberia between tests, he said, the signal cleaned itself. Less noise, stronger phase lock. Dana looked at me sharply. Garrett. I went back to the comm module, pulled up the curves again and saw it. We'd spent hours assuming power input was the cause. The Soviet notes were messier than that. In 2 separate entries, Vasiliev described external energy as distortion, noise, surface interference. It didn't always prevent a cycle, but it roughened the pattern. If that reading was right, shutting everything down might not save us. It might remove the interference and let the cycle resolve. I ordered shutdown anyway. There are decisions you make because every available option is contaminated, and one of them at least looks like action. Full mission drawdown. Non-essential systems dark. Survey equipment offline. Seismic charges secured. Prep the rover for relocation to the secondary site. Alcott appeared in the comm module doorway before Dana finished the checklist. He'd heard enough to understand the stakes and not enough to stop believing he could bargain with them. You're evacuating from a functioning interplanetary displacement system, he said. I'm relocating 12 kilometers away from something with a documented history of killing everyone near it. We don't know that. We know what a panicked Soviet installation thought it observed 50 years ago. We know enough. He stepped farther into the light. Do you understand what you are throwing away? An active mechanism, a transport technology operating at planetary scale. If we can observe discharge conditions, observe from a distance. Distance is ignorance. The people who changed history did not do it from 10 kilometers away. There it is, I said. That's what this is to you. His expression didn't change. History doesn't reward the people who survive politely, Garrett. Dana killed another bank of systems while he was speaking. Emergency lighting rolled through the habitat in dim amber strips. By the time the last non-essential system went dark, I was already moving to the medical bay to transfer Neil. He was standing, suit half on. We're relocating, I said. He sealed the wrist rings. Shutting down won't help. I stopped. Explain. The energy from the surface. His cadence had shifted again. Not full Vasiliev, but something translated in the mouth before it became sound. You think it is feeding the cycle. It is roughening it, interrupting coherence. Vasiliev learned this too late. I keyed Dana. Tell me what the curve is doing." Her answer came back 6 seconds later, controlled in exactly the way you only control your voice when panic is already trying the handle. It spiked the moment the shutdown completed. We passed the Soviet inflection point 90 seconds ago. I pulled Neil toward the door. "Suit up, now." He moved fast. I hit the general channel while he sealed his helmet. "Dana, full EVA. Rover Bay in 3 minutes. Alcott, acknowledge." Dana came back immediately. Alcott's channel stayed open and silent for 5 long seconds. Then, "Acknowledged." The Rover Bay sat under emergency lights, the vehicle already half awake under Dana's hands. She ran the startup sequence like someone moving on the far side of fear. Neil strapped into the rear compartment. I checked the internal tracker. 3 signals in the bay. The 4th was moving south through the habitat's exterior airlock. Already suited, already outside, already walking toward grid 14. "Raymond," I said on direct channel. "Stop," he answered at once. "The formation is entering active discharge. This is the only chance to observe it directly. You are not going back. If I can reach the command center, the Soviet monitoring equipment may still be usable. Their instruments were hardwired into the substrate. No external power required. You will die." The Soviets survived multiple cycles inside the bunker. The Soviets lost men to wall fusion and spatial overlap. They were at the anchor. I won't be. The command center is above the sealed stairwell. Vasiliev's own logs suggest attenuation with distance. His transponder showed him already 300 meters from us, moving at a steady pace across open ground. I could chase him. I could maybe catch him. I could certainly lose time. Neil watched me from the back seat. Dana's hands hovered over the rover controls, waiting. There are decisions no training fully prepares you for because they are not technical decisions. They are arithmetic problems done in human lives. "Raymond," I said, keeping my voice level because something in me still needed the record to show I had made the attempt. "Come back. I know why you're asking." "Then do it." "No." A pause. "Good luck, Garrett." I cut the channel. "Dana, drive." She drove like she meant to outrun geometry. The rover bucked across broken terrain, electric motors whining at maximum output. 12 kilometers to the secondary site. 40 minutes if the surface cooperated. Behind us, through the rear camera feed, grid 14 sat under a sky that was starting to deform. 7 minutes into the drive, the horizon over the bunker site bent. It didn't shimmer. The relation between ground and upper atmosphere compressed, as though space itself had been folded at the seam. A column of dust rose vertically from the site and stopped in mid-air, suspended grain by grain. The vibration started first, Neil said from the back. His voice was mostly his own, with the old cadence faint beneath it like an echo under floorboards. "Before the first shift, we thought seismic. It is synchronization." "With Siberia?" Dana asked. "With the counterpart. Same point. Different surface. The first overlap hit us at 6.5 kilometers. Less than a second. The rover display filled with angular characters I didn't recognize. Steering went dead in Dana's hands. The forward camera showed dark soil, trees, snow under a heavy sky. And then Mars snapped back into place. The system shuddered, and Dana had control again. Neither of us said anything for 2 seconds. There was nothing useful to say. A second flicker at 7 kilometers. This time my suit readout flashed ambient pressure and temperature consistent with Earth at high altitude. -22. For a quarter second I was looking at telemetry from someone else, and then it cleared. "The field's broader than their records indicated," Dana said. "The 5th is stronger," Neil said. "Each cycle grows." The flickers stopped after 8.5 kilometers. At 12, Dana braked hard beside the secondary cache and cut the motor. The silence inside the cab lasted perhaps 1 full breath. Then Neil convulsed. Every muscle in him locked at once. His back arched against the restraints. His fingers splayed. The console dumped warnings faster than I could read them. Heart rate over 180. Blood oxygen dropping, neural activity pattern invalid. His comm channel carried a sound I will remember until I die. A scream forced through a body whose muscles were all trying to contract at the same time. Then it stopped. One state gave way to another with no taper and no recovery curve between them. I was out of my seat and half over the rear console when the discharge hit. The camera feed behind us showed the sky above Grid 14, occupying more than one condition at once. Martian terrain overlaid with something else. Not one clean, alternate image, but layered resolutions fighting for the same frame. Dust, soil, structural fragments, landscapes trying to become mutually exclusive and failing. The effect lasted maybe 10 seconds. The rover clock glitched through it, so I can't do better than maybe. When it ended, the sky cleared. The terrain beneath it had changed. The shifted zone was larger. Even at 12 kilometers, through magnification, I could see new material around the original Soviet footprint. More than the forest, more than the bunker. Additional structures or geological forms where nothing had stood before. I looked back at Neil. His eyes were open, focused, breathing, ragged but normalizing. "Neil." He turned his head toward me with normal speed, normal confusion. His face was his own again. "He's gone," he said. "Vasiliev?" The discharge recognized whatever imprint was in me, reached for it, took it back. Neil flexed his hand slowly, as if each finger had to be reintroduced to him. The language, the reflexes, the second set of memories. Gone. "How do you feel?" He thought about that longer than a healthy man should have needed to. "Smaller?" he said. He sat up carefully in the restraints, staring at his hands. When he was in there, everything had extra weight. 2 interpretations of every sound, 2 reactions to every face. Now it's 1 again. Mostly. What did it take? That's the problem. I don't know how to inventory what isn't supposed to have edges. I waited. He kept staring at his palms through the gloves. I can remember that I used to care very strongly about some things. Music, food, the color of my kitchen in the morning. I know those rooms existed. I can't get back into them. The line that followed came out with such plain bewilderment it hurt more than fear would have. It's like a bookshelf where the titles have been sanded off. I had no training for that. No protocol for a man who had survived by becoming briefly inhabited and came back missing private portions of himself. I put a hand on his shoulder because it was the only thing I had that wasn't false. We made camp at the secondary site and sent what we could. Dana brought the uplink online, transmitted the Soviet logs, our survey data, emission curves, translated notes, medical observations, and an emergency advisory that no one would believe enough on first reading. Soviet installation discovered at Grid 14. Active spatial displacement phenomenon. 1 team member lost to discharge conditions. 1 team member affected by anomalous cognitive transfer. Recommend immediate quarantine classification for all corresponding coordinates. Orbital acknowledged. Requested clarification. I gave them less than they wanted and more than they would understand. Alcott's telemetry died at the moment of discharge. No later signal. Dead, displaced, or somewhere our receivers could no longer reach. The distinction no longer mattered operationally. It mattered to me more than I liked. He had been wrong in the specific way brilliant men are often wrong. Not about the magnitude of the discovery, but about the assumption that magnitude grants immunity. Neil stabilized physically. Cognitive screens showed little. Memory, language, problem-solving, spatial reasoning, normal or close enough. The losses he reported were too intimate for standardized tests to touch. He ate when reminded, slept in short fragments, answered questions politely. The politeness bothered me. Before the stairwell, Neil had complained as a form of social proof. About ration packs, about glove stiffness, about my timing on check-ins. His grumbling had been a sign that he was present inside his own life. Now it was gone. On the 3rd day, I drove back toward Grid 14 alone. Dana knew where I was going and didn't stop me. That was either trust or fatigue. Maybe both. I halted at 1 kilometer from the new perimeter. Through magnification, the site looked like geology after a fever dream. The original displaced crescent of Siberian ground still formed the core, but around it lay additional layers of material fused into the Martian surface in violent, overlapping strata. Some of it was rock unlike anything I recognized from Mars or Earth. Some of it looked structural. Partial walls, conduit-like forms, shattered surfaces of some unknown build. From that distance, it was impossible to tell what had once been architecture and what had only become architecture adjacent during displacement. Near the southeastern edge, where the new material thinned into undisturbed ground, I saw the case. Bright orange, hard-sided, American field issue, Ares markings on the lid. I zoomed harder. Our mission was Ares 4. The case was marked Ares 7. I stared at it for a very long time. 5 existed only as planning paperwork. 6 and 7 were not missions. They were future placeholders in budgetary language. Yet there the case sat, half embedded in fused regolith, angled as though dropped into place during the event, bright and wrong against the red. I did not have proof of a full theory. I had one impossible object and a mechanism already capable of reaching between planets. Maybe time was involved, maybe branching mission timelines, maybe some spatial system so deep it made ordinary sequence meaningless. Whatever the explanation, one conclusion was unavoidable enough to sicken me. The anchor's reach was not limited to the clean present tense. I recorded my field log into the rover backup in case the primary archive failed. Grid 14 must be quarantined indefinitely. The Siberian counterpart, if identifiable, must be secured under absolute prohibition of deep drilling, large-scale energy input, or continued human proximity. No mission should approach within 10 kilometers of the anchor site. It is a catastrophic environmental feature, not a problem waiting for better tools. It reaches across worlds, times, and categories, with consequences we do not understand and cannot control. I also recorded what I did not believe Command would honor. They would come back. The scientific value alone would bring them. The military implications would ensure funding. Someone would read the same records I had read and conclude not that the site was untouchable, but that the Soviets had merely been under-equipped. Someone would bring cleaner power, deeper drills, better models, more confident mathematics. Someone would look at the danger and decide it was just the old name for unsolved engineering. The anchor would absorb the attention the way it absorbed everything else. The cycles would continue. The shifted zone would grow. And eventually, if the orange case meant what I feared it meant, some future expedition would arrive believing it was the first. I drove back at sunset. From 12 kilometers away, Mars looked unchanged, flat, rust-colored, vast. The only sign of the wound at Grid 14 was a faint haze hanging above the horizon. Dust or particulate matter still suspended where the discharge had altered the air enough to forget how settling worked. Neil was sitting in the open airlock of the shelter module when I returned, visor down, breathing recirculated air, staring at his hands. He had been doing that often. I sat beside him. Our suit joints clicked against the metal decking. The Martian sky had gone from blood-dark red at the horizon to near black overhead. "How are you doing?" I asked. He turned his hands over, studying the palms as if they might eventually confess something. "I keep reaching for things that aren't there." "Memories?" "Not exactly, or not only." He folded his hands together. "Reactions, preferences. The way I used to lean towards something before I even knew I was choosing it. The little automatic parts." I waited. That had become my most useful skill with him, not filling silence too soon. "The machinery still works," he said. "The calibration's off. We'll get you to orbit. Full medical suite, neurology, imaging." He shook his head gently. "They'll find a healthy man with a good pulse and some strange self-reported deficits." He looked at me then, and the expression on his face was worse than panic had been. Panic is loud. This was quiet enough to live with. "I'm standing in 2 rooms, Garrett. One of them is full. One of them is empty. I can't remember which one used to be mine." There was nothing honest I could say that sounded like comfort. So I stayed there with him in the airlock, looking out across the plain toward the faint haze above Grid 14, where a piece of Siberia and a dead Soviet installation and something older than either, and perhaps something that had not happened yet, were all pressed together into the same wound in the surface of Mars. 19 days until pickup, then orbit, then Earth. Debriefings, classifications, strategic reviews, committees full of people who had never stood in a frozen tree line on another planet and smelled nothing because there was no atmosphere to carry smell. People who would read my report and compare risk to opportunity in clean rooms under safe gravity. People who would say words like containment and study and controlled access. People who would mistake repeated catastrophe for a solvable pattern because human institutions are built, in part, on the refusal to believe that some doors should remain closed. Somewhere in eastern Siberia, 80 meters below soil first pierced by a Soviet drilling team half a century earlier, the other anchor waited in darkness. Maybe quiet. Maybe cycling. Maybe already listening for the next pulse of energy. The next curious species to mistake responsiveness for invitation. The anchor did not care about Vasiliev, or Alcott, or Neil, or me. It did not care about the dogs frozen at the fence line, or the men embedded in the lower walls, or the suited dead in the infirmary, sealed into hardware meant for Mars. It operated without malice, without intention, as much a part of the world as weather or gravity, older than our history, older than the ruins beneath it, operating on timescales and rules that made human chronology feel parochial. Long after our habitat had been hauled away or buried, long after the fence posts and birch trunks and concrete shells had been eroded into unrecognizable mineral confusion, it would still be there, cycling, waiting for alignment, holding open the exact coordinates where worlds, times, and human certainty could be forced into each other until they stopped making sense. Beside me, Neil flexed his fingers once, slowly, as if checking whether they still answered to him. Above Grid 14, the haze did not settle. It hung in the thin Martian air like a mark left on glass by a hand that had touched from the other side, keeping the place visible, keeping the space warm for whatever the anchor decided to take next.